We've previously discussed categorical filtering, but there's other types of filtering inside of Tableau. We're going to explore some of those options in this video today. If you're following along, make sure to download the zip file and then go ahead and rename your Lesson 6 Start JavaScript to Tutorial. You can, of course, as always, begin from your last HTML file and tutorial.js from the previous video. Let's go ahead and open the tutorial.js and scroll to the bottom so we can make a couple more functions. I'm going to create a function called showRange, and the idea here is that we're going to actually filter to a range on a measure instead of that filtering to specific values on a dimension. We're going to filter on a measure with a min, which we'll call min val, and a max, which we'll call max val for this function. Now, the beginning of this filter is going to look pretty similar to our categorical filtering. We're going to say sheet equals workbook dot get active sheet, and just as before, we'll say we're going to apply a filter, but instead of apply filter async, we're going to call this function apply range filter async. Just like apply filter async, apply range filter async, you need to pass in a name of a filter. In this case, we'll pass in the name of the filter that's being passed in to showRange. But instead of telling apply range filter async a set of strings to filter to, we are going to need an object which has the options for this apply range filter async. And this object is going to look similar to our embedding options object, where we say min colon, and then we'll just give it that min val that's being passed into showRange. We'll also say max val. Now we need to make sure to close the options object here. Then we close the apply range filter async function and then give it a semicolon. Then we close our showRange function. We'll hit save. I'm going to open up my lesson 6 start HTML, and we'll make sure to add a button for this showRange filter. And just to clean things up, we're getting a lot of buttons here, so I'm going to create a new column of buttons. And to do that, I'm actually going to, outside of this unordered list, which starts way up here, I'm going to just create a new unordered list. So I'll copy paste that unordered list with the ID of menu in there. Probably should change the name to menu 2. And then we'll close that unordered list. Inside of that, we need a nav header. So we'll copy paste one of our nav headers from before, but we'll call it advanced filters. Now we're going to create a new button. So grab one of our buttons from before. Doesn't matter which one. Paste it in. And we're going to call this filter to range. Instead of solution, we're going to call that showRange function we just created. And we have to pass in the name of the filter. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in sum of number of toys. This is a measure that exists in our visualization. And I'm going to pass in a minimum of 2 and a maximum of 5. Close my parentheses there. Once again, since we're inside of a double quoted area here, make sure to, inside of there, use single quotes. We'll go ahead and hit save, and we'll run this in Chrome. So we have our new button there. Now, just to make things clear, all of these books here, or most of these books, we have 1 of, and then some of these big items we have 8 of. So we want to filter to just items where we have 2 to 5. We filter down, and there we see the filter works. All of these have 4, 5, 3, and so on. Let's explore that filter options object that we had there in apply range filter async. We use min val and max val. Just as we saw in our embed options object, we can choose which options we actually use. We can leave this empty, which would not really apply a filter at all. Or we can just choose one of these. So if I commented out max and then got rid of that comma since it's now the last option, I hit save. I'll run my HTML in Chrome. And now I filter to range. Now you'll see things that are 11 greater than that filter to 7 that we created earlier with the max. So this is just filtering on a minimum. Similarly, if we go back to our JavaScript here, we can comment out the minimum, only filter a max, launch it in Chrome, and then choose filter to range. And you'll notice we have nothing above 7 here, but we do have all of those number of toys 1. So you get to choose which options you put in your filter options. I'm going to put min and max back in there and talk about one more option that you get inside of the range filter options, and that's your null option. So that looks something like this, null option. And you have 3 options for it: null values, or you can also put inside of there non-null values, or you can do all values. And those do just what they sound like. If you put in null values, you would see only your null values for that measure. I'm not sure why you'd want to do that. That might be useful for some things. If you put non-null values, you would filter out all of the null values. And if you put all values, you'd make sure that you were getting all of your values. Now, in this particular visualization, we don't have any null values, so we won't be able to demonstrate that, but it should be pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to comment out the null option and bring back our max here. The second type of filter I want to cover today is a date filter. To do a date filter, you actually get 3 ways you can do it. You can use categorical filters the same way we did in our previous filtering video. You can use a range filter as we've done just right now, or there's also a completely separate function called relative date filter. But I want to do those in order. Now, if you recall, we already have a variety of categorical filters, functions that call categorical filters: show only, also show, don't show. So I don't need to actually create a new function. I just want to call those categorical filters a little bit differently, and I want to do it with a date instead of with that category dimension from previous. So I'm going to grab a button, copy paste it. What I would like to do is have a button that filters, call it show 99 through 2003 categorically. And the way it's going to work is that it's going to call our show only function from before, but instead of doing it on category, we're going to do it on year of our date field. And we're going to have to pass in an array of all of the values for which we want to see. We want to see 1999. We want to see 2000. Oops. We want to see 2001, 2002, and 2003. Make sure to close all of those with your single quotes. Then close the array. Then close the show only function with the parentheses. And we should already have our double quotes to end the onClick call. We should be good to go. Looks like I need to put that bracket right back in there. Hit save. And we'll launch in Chrome. Let's go to our line chart and make it easier to see what we're filtering to. By default, we have 1985 to 2011. We will filter it to 99 to 2003, and there it goes, it works. For the second option for doing date range filters would be just your apply range filter async that we've used in show range. But it's going to work a little bit differently, and that's just because for our show range function we created previously, we just called it with a couple of integers, min val and max val. You actually have to call, if you're going to filter on dates, with a date object, a JavaScript date object. So let's see how that's done. We'll call our new function show date range. Going to look pretty similar to our show range. It's going to have filter, min date, and max date. Grab our sheet from the workbook. And we'll apply a range filter to that. Same as before. Pass in the filter. For min, though, we're not just going to pass in min date. We're going to create a new date object. This is part of JavaScript. This new date constructor takes in a variety of options, but in this case, we'll pass in a string that represents the date we want. That'll convert it to a date object. And we'll do the same with our max date. And I put a semicolon there, but since we're in an object here, we need to just put a comma. Close the bracket for that object. Close the parentheses there. Give ourselves a semicolon and close the function. Then we'll go back to our HTML and just create a new button that actually calls that. So I'll grab this button here, paste it in. We're going to call this show 95 through 2005 with range. And the function that we're going to call in there is that one we just created, show date range. We don't need to, since we're calling the whole date field, we don't need to specify whether it's a year. We just say that it's the date field. We don't need to give it every value. Just once again, we need to give it the minimum, 1995, followed by the maximum, 2005. These are strings that when they are surrounded with that JavaScript new date, will convert it to an actual date object. And let's save that. Bring it into Chrome. We have our new button. Once again, we'll go to our line chart and we'll filter from 1995 to 2005. Now, because we used apply range filter async the same way we did in show range, the behavior is going to be pretty similar. That is, we can comment out min and give it only a max, or max and give it only a min, etc. We could use that null option if we'd like. There's one other type of option that I haven't talked about, and that's is exclude mode. By default, this is false. So what we're saying is we're in include mode. All the dates in between this min date and this max date, include them. But if you turned on true for is exclude mode, you would say these dates in between our min date and our max date, exclude them and show us whatever else was already being shown besides those. Pretty similar to in Tableau Desktop. If you create a new filter, you get that option of doing it in exclude mode if you'd like. And the cool thing about is exclude mode is that it is an object that you can create for all of your different filters. Not only apply range filter async, but also apply filter async. So if you wanted to call this and say, let's exclude our stuffed animal, then you can go ahead and pass in a new object there as the fourth argument to apply filter async. Do is exclude mode true, and then you would achieve that. In this particular case with the dates, range of dates, it doesn't make too much sense, so I'll just go back to the function we had. And we'll move on to the last way to do date range filters. And that is a relative date filter. So let's say I wanted to make a function called show last n years. Be similar function to before. We need a name of a filter. Instead of a min and a max, we just say how many years. We'll grab the active sheet. And instead of the previous functions we've been using, we're going to call this new one called apply relative date filter async. We're going to tell it the dimension to filter on once again. And once again, we're going to, as the second argument, give it an object of options. Now, the options for relative date filter async are a little different. The first important one is period type. This is pretty self-explanatory. We're going to do year because we want to do last n years. But you could do month, week, day, etc. Second important option is range type. If we're saying last n years, then we want to say that the range type is last n. But you could do next n years if you wanted to. And finally, you need to give it this option range n. And that's going to be how many? What is n? What does n equal? In this case, it's that year's integer, which is the option for calling in the show last n years. That's all of the options we're going to use for now. So we'll save our JavaScript and we'll be sure to come to our HTML and create a new button for that. We'll call this button show last 10 years. And we'll call the function we just created, which is show last n years. Tell it what dimension to filter on, in this case date, and give it an integer for how many is n. Save that. Open it up in our web browser. Go to the line chart and say show us the last 10 years. And there we have it, starting in 2004 until now. Let's explore one more option that you can pass in to relative date filter async, and that's an option called anchor date. So by default, anchor date equals today. So we say last 10 years from today. But you can also tell it to set when last 10 years starts with this anchor date option. Now you need to pass in a date object similar to the date object we had for min and max and apply range filter in our show date range function. But if we want to give our caller of show last n years the ability to choose an anchor date, so we need to add that to the list of arguments. And we need to convert this to a date object, declare our date object, and then we'll say date object equals new date anchor. Convert that to a date object, pass it into anchor date. We'll save this, go to our HTML, and create a function that uses that. Now let's say we wanted to filter to just 1990 to 2000. We could do that with our show date range function, of course. But if we wanted to do it with our show last n years, we would say filter on the date, the last 10 years, but starting in the year 2000. Save that, bring it in our web browser, go to our line chart, and we'll show 1990 to 2000, and it works. Now, there's one thing here before I continue. We need to make sure that our show last n years function works for both the case where you give it an anchor and when you don't. Problem is, this new date anchor is going to error out because we don't have anything in anchor. That's null. So we could create two different functions if we wanted to, but let's explore a way that we might do that dynamically. So underneath date object, we'll say if anchor, which will return true if it exists, if they've passed in an anchor string. Then we will call new date anchor. Else, they didn't pass in an anchor, so we assume they want today. JavaScript gives you a nice, easy way to create a date object, which is today, with just date, open parentheses, close parentheses. And now, this is dynamic. They can choose an anchor or they can't, but they still will pass in either today or their chosen anchor. I'll hit save, open this up in Chrome, go to our line chart, I'll show last 10 years, that works 2003 and on. If I refresh and go back to the line chart, so does our show 1990 to 2000, even though they're using the same functions. And that covers it for advanced filtering. We've explored the other types of filtering besides categorical filtering, so I hope you've gotten a lot out of it. Our next video is actually the last JavaScript tutorial video, and it's going to be covering utility functions, things like export to PDF, show the shared dialog, so on and so forth. So if you're going to be needing to do any of that, I recommend watching that video. Bye.